Good morning for those of you who are watching us live. It's morning here in Southern California. Welcome to the latest edition of our Election Science Office Hours, which is a webinar and podcast hosted by the Lynn Center for Science, Society, and Policy here at Caltech and moderated by me, Michael Alvarez. You can find our archive that's now got over 24 of these episodes. It's on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And all the episodes are listed on our Caltech Election Integrity Project page at our website, protectingtheelection.us. Be sure to follow the Lynn Center on social media for the latest updates on our work on elections and democracy and all the projects that the Lynn Center is doing here at Caltech. We're also now recently on Instagram and Facebook, expanding our social media footprint, in addition to LinkedIn, X, and Blue Sky. And as I said before, we're recording, and also if anybody has a question, please pop it in the chat, and we'll try to get those as time allows. Now, today, the topic that we're going to have a conversation about is military and overseas voting, which is a really complicated topic, maybe not surprisingly when you hear some of the complicating issues. And I'm really going to need the expertise of our three guests today to help us understand and kind of walk through some of the issues that military personnel, their dependents, and other Americans abroad face. But before we get into that, I just wanted to do a quick dive into terminology and again, define this population of Americans who we're going to be talking about today, and the two primary federal laws that provide for their voting rights. And I'm going to quote directly from the Federal Voting Assistance Program's website. Federal Voting Assistance Program, or FVAP, is the federal organization that helps coordinate the efforts to maintain the voting rights of Americans abroad, military personnel, and their dependents. The first important term is UOCAVA. So we may use that term today. The Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, and this is a quote from FVAP, is commonly referred to as UOCAVA. UOCAVA citizens are U.S. citizens who are active members of the Uniformed Services, the Merchant Marine, the Commissioned Corps of the Public Health Service, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, their eligible family members, and U.S. citizens residing outside the U.S. This act provides the legal basis for these citizens' absentee voting requirements for federal offices. So that's what UOCAVA means. UOCAVA was subsequently amended and somewhat changed by what's called the MOVE Act. And the MOVE Act is, again, to quote, Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act. It amended UOCAVA and other statutes by providing greater protections for service members, their eligible family members, and other overseas citizens. Among other provisions, the MOVE Act requires states to send absentee ballots to UOCAVA voters at least 45 days before federal elections. So again, we've established right now what UOCAVA means, MOVE, and hopefully FVAP. So I hope that everybody who's watching is taking good notes, because in the spirit of a professor doing office hours, I think maybe we'll have a quiz at the end. Just a joke, we're not going to have a quiz. But in any case, I'm excited today not to have just one guest or two guests, but I've got three guests who are amazing experts in this area and are people who I've had the honor of working with in the past and have interacted quite a bit with. It's really exciting for me to have these three folks with us today. So joining me today is Casandra Hockenberry. Casandra is the program manager for the Overseas Voting Initiative at the Council of State Governments. The Overseas Voting Initiative, and I think we'll call that OVI, is a collaboration between the U.S. Department of Defense Federal Voting Assistance Program, or FVAP, and the Council of State Governments. Our other two guests, Paul Lux and Hilary Rudy, are members of the Overseas Voting Initiative Working Group of state and local election officials. Paul is the longtime elected supervisor of elections in Okaloosa County, Florida. Hilary serves as the deputy state elections director in the Colorado Secretary of State's office, where she's served through multiple administrations. So thank you three for being with us this morning or this afternoon, as it may be, on Election Science Office Hours. Excited to have you here, and certainly we have a lot to talk about. So we'll get started. Now, Cassandra, Hilary, and Paul, since there are three of you here today, I didn't have an opportunity really to spend a lot of time giving the details of each of your biographies because they're extensive and very distinguished. But what I'd like to do quickly is, for the benefit of people who are watching, can each of you quickly tell us how you got into the elections field and specifically why you decided to work on military and overseas voting? And let's start with Cassandra.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I think, like most people in the election space, I accidentally fell into it. My family has a very long history of military service, and I was looking to transition away from my career as a public defender. I knew I wanted a job where I could make a difference. And I had been working in Eastern Kentucky at the time, and a position came up at the Council of State Governments, which is headquartered in Lexington, Kentucky. And so I decided to trade the 3 a.m. phone calls to come out to murder scenes to transition to the very, very calm, not at all stressful world of elections.
That's great. Hillary, how about your sort of origin story in elections as well as military and overseas voting?
Yeah, thanks for having me as well. I would say that similarly, I fell a bit into it. I was in law school and trying to decide what I was going to do with that degree, and I took an internship at the Colorado Secretary of State's office, and that was when they were implementing legislation locally to implement the Help America Vote Act, and that is how I got into elections. But then early in my career, one of our secretaries was interested in doing some reform to make it easier for deployed military and particularly advanced deployed military to vote based on his own experience while deployed. And so I was involved with that legislation, but then also with a task force that he created to try and figure out how we could get some solutions. And so that's really how I started getting involved in military and overseas voting. And honestly, it's become a passion over the years to try and figure out how can we make it easier. So
Mhm.
that's kind of how I got here.
Great, thank you. And we'll talk about some of those efforts at those reforms as we get further into this conversation. So, Paul, your origin story and why military and overseas voters.
Well, I'll start with the very brief bio point that I am an Army veteran. My wife is a retired Army veteran. And so I served in all three roles: active duty, I was a reservist for a number of years, and then a military family member following my wife around until she retired. So I've had all three jobs, if you will, that the military have to offer. And as I like to tell groups of people who are not familiar with how elections work, no one ever wakes up one day in high school and says, I think I want to work in elections. Everybody falls into it somehow, and it either sticks with you and
Yep.
you're in it, or you bounce off, peripherally, and we never see you again.
Mhm.
I started in the elections office here in Okaloosa County, Florida in 1999. So yeah, that's right. I just used the word Florida in 1999 in the same sentence, which means I was here for the 2000 election. Now, my county is a big rectangle.
Mhm.
The northern border is Alabama. The southern border is the Gulf of whatever you prefer to call that Gulf below us. And we are home to the largest Air Force base in the world, called
Mhm.
Eglin Air Force Base. It is a 20-mile wide swath of federal property that cuts my county into two pieces. And as the largest Air Force base in the world, most of the people associated with that base live in my county. And so 1/5 of my voting population are military and military family, whether they are here or whether they are absent, thus making them eligible to be UOCAVA citizens. And so we have a lot of people all across the globe. I have a lovely map board in my office that shows pins where I have people voting from all over the globe.
Mhm. So direct experience yourself with some of the issues, as well as quite a few voters in your jurisdiction in Okaloosa County, right,
Absolutely.
who have these kind of issues that we're going to be talking about today. So Cassandra, let's talk about the Overseas Voting Initiative. I'm familiar with a lot of work you do because I've presented at some of your meetings over the years and have been involved in ways that I can be involved as a researcher. But For those people who are watching this webinar, can you set the stage for this conversation and tell us a little bit more about the OVI? What is it? How did it get started? Who's in it? And in particular, what kind of work are you producing these days?
Absolutely. So 12 years ago in 2013, FVAP partnered with the Council of State Governments to better support states as they work to reduce the barriers that these voters are facing and improve the voter experience for these military service members, their families, and overseas citizens. FVAP saw it as a great way to create a direct line of communication with the states. And CSG saw it as a great way to both support state policymakers as well as state election officials, while also supporting those citizens that are doing so much for our country while they're serving in the military or living abroad. And so for us, it was really an easy decision. We partner with our friends over at the Turnout, Jared Marcotte, Grace Gordon, and they've been a part of the project since 2015. We have a working group of 30 state and local election officials. We are chaired by Secretary Pate of Iowa and Secretary Toulouse Oliver of New Mexico. And we are really fortunate in our work that we've built really great relationships with the Department of State, the United States Postal Service, and the Military Postal Service Agency. And that has allowed us to really provide some direct insight and support around very specific issues that we tend to see in ballot return processes, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Historically, our work has focused on developing best practices and supporting different ways to improve administrative processes for election officials. For example, the OVI supported the redesign of the federal postcard application and the federal write-in absentee ballot so that it looked less like a tax form, which is absolutely what it looked like pre-2013. We also collaborate with our working group of election officials to gain a deeper understanding of what factors may be contributing to successful navigation of the voting process. And we do this through the EVE Section B data standard, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. And we are also fielding voter experience surveys and providing analysis of those experiences to the states. Our best practices, especially now, are really focused on identifying both legislatively the best practices. So election officials are able to say to their legislator, hey, heard you're interested in this policy, and here are the components that we'd really like you to delineate so that we're not struggling to implement. And then we work with the election officials to then create corresponding implementation best practices that they can share with each other to say, this is what's worked in my jurisdiction or how we've implemented it. And the last thing we do is really trying to keep up with those issues that are directly impacting UOCAVA voters. Recently, it's meant that I've spent a lot of time figuring out how mail processes can be affected by tariffs and customs and international conflicts. So it's a blast.
Right. And like I said earlier, it's a complicated issue. And again, I think we're going to start peeling this onion as we go forward in this conversation. Now, kind of like Paul, I got my start in this field like in 1999. And in the 2000 election was the first time I actually ever heard of UOCAVA voters, and was actually kind of really shocked, right, when I learned, first off, the huge number of Americans who are covered by the UOCAVA Act, the incredible difficulties that back then they faced, right?
Certainly.
Exactly, getting and returning their ballots, and all the efforts that were being done to try to help them, exercise their right to vote. Now, there was a lot of work done, and we'll talk about some of that. But as I was saying earlier, because we were kind of waiting for this to start, I think during the pandemic, I think a lot of folks just seem to forget about UOCAVA voters. And then I think now we're back to a point where I think there's some important issues that are face them in 2026. And so can you help us kind of set the further stage by talking about what do we know about the UOCAVA electorate today? I mean, in particular, how
Mhm.
many do we think there might be UOCAVA voters and their demographics and kind of do you know where they're located?
Absolutely. So I will start off by saying the Federal Voting Assistance Program conducts post-election surveys on these voters,
Mhm.
and that gives us some roundabout numbers in terms of how many there are. So there are approximately 1.3 military service members, and 75% of those are eligible for UOCAVA protections. The other 25%, it's because they have registered to vote where they're currently living, and so they're not outside of their voting district. As to overseas citizens, it's estimated that there are about 4.4 million overseas citizens living abroad, 2.8 of which are eligible to vote, which means they're 18 or older. So I think it's important to note, though, when you're talking those military service members, as I mentioned, you're not just talking the soldiers and sailors, you're actually also talking about their partners. If
Mhm.
they have dependents, so children who reach the age of 18, they are also eligible to vote under these protections. I also really think it's important to talk about overseas citizens and who they are. This is a really broad group of people, which is part of what causes so many problems trying to reach these individuals, because it's not just, one company or one set of students studying abroad. Any student that's studying abroad outside of the US, and if they're outside of the US during the election, guess what?
Mhm.
They qualify. This is individuals working for multinational organizations that maybe have to work in an office abroad. This is mission workers, Peace Corps workers, Department of State employees and their families who very frequently have to move with them. This is international volunteers like Red Cross, scientists, members of the CDC. And the one that I always think is so interesting is offshore oil rig workers. If they are, more than a mile offshore, they are
Mhm.
officially in international waters, and they are now eligible to vote as a UOCAVA voter. But I think part of the problem is, other than that, we don't actually have a lot of data around these individuals, because they're not getting sort of the surveys and the outreach that we see many US based voters getting before and after the election. So
Mhm.
there are a lot of things we unfortunately don't know about these voters that we, as the OVI, are trying to find those gaps. So, as a part of a recent meeting, we heard from military spouses and overseas citizens who have or are still voting from overseas. And in those conversations, we learned something new every single time. We started talking about Denmark and the fact that they're getting rid of postal mail, or sorry, letter mail.
Mhm.
We talked about and the USPS has shut down service to Venezuela because they're having carrier issues, which is a potential issue. We heard from a citizen who's a former military service member and now a civilian living in Melbourne, Australia. And there are times his mail can take 90 days round trip
Mhm.
from and back to the United States. And this is Melbourne, Australia. He's not living in austere conditions. He's living in a city. Um, and then we're also looking and seeing a lot of states passing um, laws around citizenship verification. And that's going to potentially cause some issues for these individuals if they have to show up in person with the documentation. That's
Mhm.
going to be complicated. Um, or if they have to digitally provide it, then you have a security risk that their personally identifiable information is going to potentially be leaked. And so I think this population is just so unique and faces so many challenges that don't get thought of. You could have paid me $100,000 and I would have never guessed that it
Mhm.
would take 90 days for mail to get to Australia. So yeah, it's just a really unique and like you said, it's an onion in terms of the issues that they face.
Right. So again, I think this identifies just one huge issue, right? Which is that, we don't really know a lot necessarily about where these people are or where they're from, or really a lot about the particular problems they may have. It's a very heterogeneous population, but a sizable population, and also concentrated in particular places, in particular states, in particular parts of states, and in many cases concentrated in places that are going to be, pivotal. In the next election cycle. So I do think that's the
Absolutely.
reason why the spotlight's going to be on UOCAVA voters in the next cycle. Now,
I agree.
so Hilary, what Casandra identified, I think one of the other interesting problems, and there's a technical term for it, which is ballot transit time. So this example of this voter in Melbourne for whom it may take 90 days for mail to get to them and back to the US. That, in the past, back when I was really heavily involved prior to the pandemic and studying UOCAVA voters, ballot transit time was the big issue. Is that still a salient problem from your perspective for UOCAVA voters?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. It remains so through the pandemic, and in fact became, in some ways, more of a challenge as we navigated the pandemic with mail disruptions globally, and even post-pandemic. Cassandra mentioned, changes in Denmark to postal letters, and disruptions in Venezuela due to carrier issues. Those types of issues kind of happen year round, and they don't take a time out for an election, unfortunately. And so I think that transit time remains a pretty significant issue for a lot of our military and overseas voters.
Are there potential solutions that you're excited about, especially ones that you might be implementing in Colorado or ones that you're hearing about from others that are perhaps going to help alleviate some of these issues in 2026 and 2028?
I don't know that there are necessarily new options. I think there are newer technologies to
Mhm.
options that we've looked at for a long time. I think, one policy decision that Colorado made several years ago is to allow voters who receive their ballot electronically to opt to return it electronically.
Mhm.
And over the years, we've navigated a lot of challenges with that. How do we maintain the security? How do we make it usable and feasible for our voters abroad? How do we make sure that we're getting everything we need back? And some of those challenges are still very much ongoing. But I think, one thing I'm excited about is as we move forward into, 26 and 28, looking at newer technologies and ways to solve some of these ongoing challenges. How do we make sure we get that signature on the affidavit that we need in Colorado? How do we make sure that we get all of the pieces of the ballot packet back if they're returning it electronically? How do we continue to make sure that we're maintaining endpoint security um, as much as we possibly can? I mean, we can't secure the internet, but we want to secure the system that's receiving those ballots back so that voters are confident that if they use that system, that their vote as they cast it will be counted.
Mhm.
And I think that's the most important factor of systems like that. So I'm excited about new technologies, and I'm excited about continuing to work on improving that process.
Mhm. Paul, is there anything you'd like to add on the ballot transit time problem, and in particular on solutions that you've got your eye on or that you may be thinking about implementing in Okaloosa?
Well, certainly, courtesy of the MOVE Act and to some degree the Help America Vote Act as well, the services for our UOCAVA population were drastically improved.
Mhm.
Mandating at that level are the requirement to make email ballots available completely eliminates, at least even for our poor friends in Australia, at least half of that transit time if I can email them a ballot, or if I have some form of online ballot portal that they can log into and get access to blank ballots. That has helped tremendously in eliminating half of the problem. The other half of the problem, as Hilary mentioned, is how do you get those ballots back? And there are plenty of states who allow them to simply attach it to an email. There are a lot of, and nothing that you can propose is going to come without security concerns. I've stood in front of plenty of the computer security experts at NIST at various conferences, explaining why we need this and listening to all of their explanations for why it's all a colossally bad idea. And to those people, I usually say, I bet you've never, been sitting in a GP medium tent in the middle of the desert wondering how you're going to vote either, right? So, there are solutions that exist. It's just a matter of how can we apply those solutions to down to our state level becomes the challenge. And I know that there are some technology providers that are working on that, and I'm following some of them, particularly the ones trying to get certified for use here in Florida, very, very closely.
So, Hilary, it's December. 2026 is right upon us. I don't know exactly what your primary schedule looks like in Colorado, but obviously you have primaries and general election. What are you going to be especially watching with regards to military and overseas voting, especially in Colorado in the midterm?
Yeah, a couple of things. So our primary is at the end of June, so it kind of cuts our year in half. And I think heading into June, we're going to be keeping a really close eye on mail delivery issues. Honestly, I think it's just a part of election administration in general to be keeping a close eye on that. But that has a particular challenge for our military and overseas voters. And so we'll be keeping a really close eye on mail disruptions globally. We'll be keeping a really close eye on, what changes can we make to our processes as we head into June. We definitely take advantage of surveying our military and overseas voters, coordinating with, the FVAP survey, but also surveying after our local elections to try and find out whether those things that we're doing are actually helping. And so we'll be taking a look at, did the last small adjustment help? And can we make another small adjustment before we get to June? The thing that we won't want to do as we head into 2026 is make any really drastic changes because we want the process to continue to be accessible. So I think we'll be keeping an eye on small changes. We'll be keeping an eye on global mail disruptions, and then also on any new legislative changes that come up. Our legislative session runs about mid-January through mid-May. And so we'll be keeping a really close eye on any changes that come out of that as well to make sure that we can smooth any implementation challenges heading into the primary.
So based on your work as a member of the OVI working group and your work, of course, in Colorado, what do you think the biggest challenges right now are, other than ballot transit time, for military and overseas voters?
I think there are a couple of challenges based on the conversations we've been having with different groups with the OVI. I think one is figuring out how to get the information they need, whether it's about how do I get the information I need to get my ballot and get it back, or how do I get the information I need to know what to vote on when I get my ballot. I think every state and jurisdiction has a lot of really different stuff on their ballot, and some of it's kind of complicated, and every state and jurisdiction has varying levels of information, that we provide to our voters. And so I think that is one significant challenge, is just figuring out how to engage with the voting process from wherever they are. And so that's one challenge we're constantly looking at trying to level. I think the other is just engaging with the Postal Service in general. I think, it is a challenge when you are overseas to try and figure out, how do I get something home? And when you're talking about something as important as your ballot, then that sort of I think raises the stakes a bit. How do I make sure that it is actually going to get there, and what's the best way to do that? And, if, for example, you're in Europe and it takes 3 weeks to get a care package, how do you plan for that when you want to make sure, it's okay if the Christmas gift arrives a little late. It's not okay if your ballot arrives a little late. And so planning around that, I think those are two of the most significant challenges. And unfortunately, they're not new challenges.
Right.
They're the same challenges we've dealt with.
Right. And so going back to the heterogeneity of this population, and just maybe thinking about military voters and their dependents, and then the other categories of overseas voters, are there specific issues that military voters face that other overseas voters don't, and vice versa?
Oh, I absolutely think so. I think in hearing from our communities, military voters who are deployed face unique challenges. We talked with voters who are at sea and they have limited access to, reliable internet. And so for voters from a state like Colorado, where we say, great, you can get that ballot back to us electronically, they say, that's fantastic. I can't stream Hulu. How can I get a ballot back to you? And so that is a challenge. Mail is a little bit slower for them as well. And so, figuring out what the best option is. But then when you think about our overseas voters, where they are, as Casandra said, a very dynamic group, and they are not a homogenous group. I think depending on where they are and what they're doing, they also face very unique challenges. When you're thinking about scientists or volunteers who are in very remote parts of the globe, they may face real challenges getting mail on a regular basis because they're very far away from that mail infrastructure. But they may also face real challenges getting reliable internet access because that infrastructure simply does not exist where they are. So they're dealing with satellite and those types of challenges. So the challenges are just, I would say, as broad and diverse as our military and overseas voters. I mean, we have had a voter in Antarctica about, I would say, 4 out of the last 6 general elections. And the challenge there is that nothing flies into Antarctica during the period in which we need to get mail there. And so that option is real limited. So we have a lot of problem solving calls, I would say, with our military and overseas voters, where we look at what their specific challenge is. Is it, an unreliable IP? They can't keep it stable. Is it that they haven't seen their mail delivery for 3 weeks? Is it that they're not sure that they, are going to be able to get themselves to an embassy to drop it there? Just a lot of varied challenges.
Thanks. And so to change the subject just a little bit, because again, we're already 30 minutes into this conversation, and your time is very valuable. But Paul, I wanted to ask you, so you mentioned earlier some of the different solutions that, you all use in Okaloosa and others use, email, web servers, US mail. Yeah, I assume that it's still possible in some places to even use fax, those kind of technologies, right? A lot of times when you think about this, the trade-offs that we're requiring the UOCAVA electorate to make are different than the trade-offs that say I face when I go to vote. And in particular, we sometimes seem to be sacrificing privacy and security for UOCAVA voters for accessibility. Now, you may not agree with that, but that's kind of my view of it, kind of looking as an outsider looking in. In your opinion, can we get to a point where we can develop a process and technologies for UOCAVA voters that can manage to deliver secure, private, and accessible voting?
Well, it certainly isn't outside of the scope of possibility. With OVI, we started very early on looking at leveraging the security behind the Common Access Card as a vehicle to help secure those transactions, which is great. But I mean, if you look at how the Department of Defense moves classified documents today, and I'm going to date myself a little bit here. And so for the people who are watching who don't understand my reference, you'll have to Google it. But long gone, are the days of Oscar Goldman with the briefcase handcuffed to him transporting classified documents. That doesn't exist anymore. They use a cloud-based solution that they think is secure enough to move classified documents from point A to point B between military facilities. If that technology could be leveraged to allow people with access to that network to be able to submit their ballots through a portal system like that and grant us access to retrieve those ballots from that portal system. I get that the Department of Defense really does not want to get into the voting business, and I don't blame them because it is one of the messiest things you'll ever step in. But at the end of the day, most of my voters would rather waive their right to a secret ballot and know that their ballot is going to get counted. They're less worried about secrecy than they are about security and then they are about getting the ballots. Now in Florida, we allow voters to fax ballots. When is the last time you saw a fax machine? I mean, unless you're in my office, because I have one,
Right.
or two. But I'm here to tell you, on election day, when that fax machine breaks, where do you go buy another one? And the answer is you go to the nearest office supply store and say, is there any chance you maybe have one? And it's not a matter of which one are you going to buy. It's a matter of, can you buy the only one they've got? And so certainly technology has improved drastically when it comes to all of those things. It's just a matter of coordinating at the right levels that use of those systems to leverage the ability for a voter to return those ballots. Most voters don't have fax machines and can't find them. Certainly, Hilary mentioned the forward deployed troops. I hear from them all the time. They don't have fax machines. They're lucky to get 20 minutes to video chat with a family member. And I'm here to tell you, if you don't make access to ballots and the ability to return ballots as easy as possible for them, they would rather spend their 20 minutes talking to their loved ones and their children than they will trying to figure out how to get a ballot and how to get it back.
So thinking about these kind of technical solutions, in this area, there has been a history and a strong legacy of, research and experimentation with respect to UOCAVA voters to try to solve these problems for them. And a lot of that's been driven by the federal government through FVAP and a number of states and counties with big UOCAVA populations, including your own. In fact, I think that's where we first met, was working on one of these projects and collaborating together on it. From my perspective, I think a lot of that momentum has dissipated. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how we can recapture some sort of need for science-driven study of solutions for UOCAVA voting and really get back to a point where we can try to drive this process forward in a strong way.
Well, and like I said, so the Department of Defense. So when we did the original voting over the internet project in 2000, which I think is where we first crossed paths, Michael. Not to date you either. But that, of course, got swallowed up in what the 2000 election became, particularly here in Florida, where we had the most number of people use that system. We followed that with the 2004 SERV project, which was actually a congressional mandate that then, when the white hat hackers' hats turned a little grayer than we thought, that project got pulled. And the federal government freaked out and said, who said we should be doing this? And the answer was, well, you did, actually. And so we've run the gamut. We did our own project in 2008 just as proof of concept, partnering with private companies to provide. We opened polling places at 3 locations across the globe where we, Okaloosa County, had high concentrations of voters: England, Germany, and Japan. We sent poll workers there. They used a system that didn't even have hard drives involved, so there was no information to be held about voters on a hard disk somewhere that had to worry about compromise. So we've been through all of these iterations of kiosk-based voting, internet-based voting, and now secure ballot return seems to be probably the direction this needs to go. Now, believe it or not, it didn't fall by the wayside for everybody during COVID, because there were so many postal disruptions globally that was a big discussion point, was how are we going to get ballots back we can email these people ballots in insert random country here, but their mail services shut down because COVID shut it down. How are those people going to be allowed to return ballots? And so that discussion didn't go away. It just kind of changed footing. But of course, now that COVID has, say, went away, still exists, of course, but no longer the focal point. We're going to have to find a way to leverage those platforms that the U.S. government thinks presumes are secure enough to move their classified documents to use to allow voters to submit ballots and for us to retrieve them, because that is probably the best way forward. I know there are places where they are already using this type of system, leveraging certain commercial services. And Florida is unfortunately not one of them. We're on the cusp right now of having those discussions with the Secretary of State's office. One of the big challenges we have with the UOCAVA voting now is the misinformation surrounding UOCAVA voting that has come out of both the 2020 and the 2024 elections. This assumption that anyone can mail in an FPCA and that we just automatically let them vote. And of course, none of that is true. But that's what, and Cassie could probably speak to it better, that's what the lawmakers are hearing from concerned citizens. And that's what the lawmakers believe to be true. And of course, it isn't true at all. They go through the same approval process that any voter goes through. But those are the kind of challenges that make the government want to stay out of it even more when we need them perhaps more involved.
So, Cassandra, do you have anything you'd like to add on this? Again, how do we recapture this kind of process of, I think, science-driven solutions for UOCAVA voting?
Absolutely. So I think this is going to maybe sound silly, and aside from our Florida supervisor on this call, I would argue we're a little bit too far from the 2000 election, and that's part of the problem. We have forgotten all of those issues that came up because that was such a national news issue. Everyone was talking about it. And, that's what spurred the Help America Vote Act. That is what spurred a lot of these infusions of research and frankly, I love research more than anything. Research costs money. And, states and local jurisdictions, they're just trying to run their election on a shoestring budget. They don't necessarily have the research and development funds to develop a new, safe, secure, accessible solution. And so I think we're so far from it. And as we've talked about, these voters are such a heterogeneous population that the issues that one voter faces probably looks different than all of the other voters, but they're all experiencing issues, but none have broadly affected them to the point that it has risen to a level that it is making those national news headlines, that it is then thus spurring legislators and federal agencies to say, you know what, we're going to invest in this research. Because at the end of the day, as much as Paul, Hilary, and I would love to research and develop something that would work, I don't have the $1 billion to do so.
Yeah, I can tell you research is not cheap. But so Cassandra, I'm going to switch topics a little bit to something that I know is a little near and dear to OVI's work, and something I think you briefly mentioned earlier, which is data standards.
Yes.
This is also something that back when I first got introduced to the elections world, I was just really, again, just kind of shocked that we didn't have a more systematic set of data standards until I talked to people like Paul and Hilary and realized why that is. Can you tell us a little bit about the data standard work that OVI is doing, and kind of what is it? How does it work? What the end goal of developing data standards is?
Absolutely. So, for any viewers out there who don't know, there is one sort of collective data research survey that goes out. That is the EVES Election Administration and Voting Survey. And that goes out after every federal election, and states supply data to that. Section B of that survey specifically deals with the experiences of military and overseas citizen voters. And so back in 2015, I think, is when the work kind of started. The OVI team began facilitating discussions with the working group of state and local election officials to figure out, is there a better way to do this? Eves is great in that it provides volumes of data, but it doesn't really allow you to dig into what is happening on the ground, what these voters are experiencing. And so we created the data standard in partnership with these individuals to, one, reduce the reporting burdens for state and election officials, while also creating a transactional level data set. This is fully anonymized. We don't know who your voter is, but what we're able to see is from the time of either registration or request through their, or ballot request, through the transmission of the ballot to the voter, the way the ballot was provided and the date that it was transmitted, all the way through to the ballot coming back, and when that ballot is processed, and when it, or whether it is accepted or rejected, and if it is rejected, what the reasoning is. I think it's important to note, again, this was not a third party developing this data standard, which I think is what's really important. These were election officials. And so the data that is collected is data that they were already collecting, and it was already being collected in their voter registration database systems. Or if it wasn't being collected, they wanted it to be collected, and it was just that they needed to make updates to their systems. Because of all that, we are now using that data in coordination with some of the voter experience surveys to begin conducting novel research on voter success, as well as some research around voters' understanding of the policy. As Hilary noted, in Colorado, you can return your ballot electronically. And the number of voters who replied in said voter experience survey that they would love to be able to return it electronically was concerning. But we're able to understand really what's affecting these voters. And then now that we have been collecting this transactional data for a while, since 2016, we're starting to be able to longitudinally look at these experiences and evaluate policy changes and how that may or may not be helping these voters, or, depending on the policy, causing more issues for these voters to be able to successfully cast their ballots. What's even more fun is, because it's so transactional level, we can look into down to the county level and be able to say, hey, this county has had no issues. Every voter got their ballot, every voter returned their ballot. And then that allows and empowers the state to go to that county and say, what are you doing that is working so well? So it's allowed us to dig even deeper and be able to share practices around what's working.
Well, that's great. And so, Hilary, can you tell us how this works at the state level? So how does this ESB data standard and this data collection process work from a state perspective? And really, what has it done for you in Colorado?
Yeah. So we've really worked to fine-tune the queries that we use in our statewide voter registration system to pull this transactional data out and provide it. And what it's done for us, well, first, that pulling that transactional level data for that portion of the survey is so much more straightforward than the remainder of EVES. It's just a much more straightforward process because we're really just pulling data and providing it. Whereas other parts of these really require you to analyze the data before you provide it. And then sometimes analyze the question to make sure you're analyzing the data correctly to answer the question. And so it's a much more straightforward data pull. But because it's transactional and over time, and we've participated since 2016, so we have several years of data now as well, it has allowed us to take a look at data over time and across counties to see, do we have training issues? Are we having a particular access issue around a particular process? It has also helped us look holistically at policy levels made at the state. So Colorado mails a ballot automatically to every voter. And so in Colorado, a UOCAVA designation really is about the additional time and options available to military and overseas voters more than it is a ballot request. But looking at the data has helped us understand there are some unintended consequences, I think, that come with that. In that if we're not getting a regular update from a voter, we may have folks staying in that status beyond their eligibility for those options and time. And so it's really helped us dig in at a more granular level to identify how can we improve our processes, how can we improve our training, and how can we improve, as Casandra said, looking at it with the voter surveys, the information we're providing to the voters so they better understand how they can interact with that system. So it's been incredibly useful from a state perspective.
Well, that's great to hear. I'm so glad that this initiative has moved forward because it was something that we'd identified decades ago as a serious issue. Now I'm gonna ask Paul this question first, which will give Hilary and Cassandra some time to think about it, about a quick answer because we're running out of time. So from the research community's perspective, the academic research community that I represent, and then I do have a little bit of influence with, and a lot of people from that community will watch this video, okay? Is there something, Paul, that we can do to help you? Or, like, what can the research community do? Is there a research question, a research problem? And it can't be stay out of your way. That's not a valid answer. But is there something that we can do to help you in particular as we start to think about this next election cycle while there's still time to think about building a partnership or collaboration?
Well, certainly, educating lawmakers is tantamount for all of us, because those are the people who set the policy that I have to follow, certainly in my state, and Hillary and hers, I suspect. I don't think you all just get to do what you want either. And so, if the lawmakers are not well informed, and if the lawmakers don't have buy-in to the research, then that becomes just an extra hurdle. So like I said, I'm working with a couple of different technology providers right now on a process that we can use to return ballots electronically, leveraging some of these same systems that the Department of Defense is using. But if my Secretary of State doesn't sign off on it and my lawmakers don't sign off on it, I'm not even going to get to the let's do it one time as a proof of concept process. So there has to be buy-in from the lawmakers, at both the federal and state level, unless the federal government wants to take the reins and put the thumb down and say, do this. Then we will. And of course, that was what drove the first two of our projects, right? The 2000 VOI project and the 2004 SERV project were from the federal government down. And then they said, "Ooh, wait a minute," and take my hands off of that and let it go, and now let the states worry about it. And we're seeing those problems now, right, with the different states, and the executive order about having things in by election day. And I know that that's caused some lawsuits, which are certainly, heaven knows where any of that's going to go either. But that's going to better inform our process for trying to move forward with this to improve that process. And I'm hopeful if it comes back the way some people are hoping it will, that it will be able to allow us to leverage that most underserved population wherever they are. And I'm talking students abroad. I'm talking missionaries on the top of mountains who get their mail on the back of a llama once every 90 days. These are the people we have to reach. We've got Starlink. We have much better satellite technology. We've just got to find a better way for a secure system. So proof of concept testing, and and reports that we can stick in front of lawmakers to read, to say, this is why it's important. Here's a solution that's been tested. We'd like to test it in a real world election environment.
Okay, that's good. Hilary, same question to you.
I mean, I don't know what I have to add to what Paul said. I think that is a common theme across states. We need compelling proof of concept research that we can put in front of lawmakers and in front of policy decision makers to say this is the right way to go and it makes good sense. So I agree 100% with everything Paul said.
Okay, great. Cassandra.
I agree with the both of them. I will just add, I think, um, listen, I love researches and I love nothing more than reading like a really dense research paper. But work with your election officials to identify how to make those things actionable.
Mhm.
Because researchers, you are rightfully thinking in the theoretical, but that can be really hard for an election official with everything else going on to make that idea actionable. So I really recommend meeting with the election officials, meeting with the community, and trying to do that. The other plug I'm going to give is because academics get these things called sabbaticals, and sometimes you guys go overseas. If you have voted while living abroad as a part of that, reach out to us. I'd love to get your feedback. I'd love to hear about your experiences. So much of what I am trying to do leading this project is to better understand the experience because every single person has a unique one, but we do start seeing through lines and threads that are really helpful for us to understand so that we can start crafting ways to overcome those things.
Excellent. That's all great suggestions. Now, so we're out of time, but real quick, Cassandra, anything you wanted to add that we haven't covered?
Nothing to add other than if you are a state election official hearing this, you will be hearing from me and my team over the coming months. We're visiting all 50 states over the next year and a half. And you will also hear from us in December next December, sorry, about participating in the EVE Section B data standard collection. So be on the lookout for those emails and just thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you. Hilary, any final comments?
I think the only thing I would add is just to signal boost the ESB data collection process that Cassandra mentioned. If you're a state or a local election official and you hear from Cassandra, provide your data. I know that the learning curve at the beginning is a little steep, but it is so worth it from the data you get back. But it's also so worth it to be able to have a apples to apples conversation across jurisdictions. So that would be my plug is provide your data if you're a local or state. And just thanks so much for this.
Great, thank you, Hilary. Paul?
Well, first, Michael, let me thank you for having us on today. It's been a privilege to be here with you and your viewers again, and looking forward to hearing all the positive comments about everything that went on. Just a foot stomp what Hilary just said about the data. Dear election administrators, don't panic when someone asks you for data like this. If we can actually get this off the ground and working the way we envision it working, we can lose a big giant section of that Eves report that you already hate. And so let me add that. And then just on a personal note, let me apologize to everyone who tuned in thinking that the Paul Lux they were going to see is the actor in Germany who stars in their Dark series that apparently is very popular. That is certainly not me.
Well, thanks for that. Thanks for that conclusion. But I want to thank the three of you for being here today. It's been a great conversation. It's great to see all three of you. And, again, as I kind of was alluding to in the previous question, look forward to having the opportunity to work with the three of you, not just this next year, but as we move forward with this great process of fixing some of these issues that face the UOCAVA electorate. So thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.